There's a curious phenomenon in modern football. Clubs who have centuries-long pedigrees are suddenly finding it hard to survive.
The end of Bury Football Club feels like a bereavement for some fans. After 134 years in the Football League, it's all over.
And the fans at Bury weren't alone, because just 25 minutes drive away there was a similar picture at Bolton Wanderers, a waiting game for a lifeline or expulsion from the league.
Devastating news for supporters who were celebrating just yesterday that 3-0 win over Stoke, and less than a month after new owners took over the club.
One of the last in the litany of beleaguered football clubs is Charlton Athletic.
Charlton and Coventry fans marched to the Valley together in a joint protest against the owners of both clubs, Roland de Chatelet of Charlton and Sisu of Coventry City.
Having dropped down into League One last season, the club is now in a race to prove to the EFL that they have sufficient funds to survive next season. If they can't, they risk being expelled from the Football League altogether.
What another terrible week for this football club that we once had. We've stood here many times before because we believe in what's right and what's wrong. We've been protesting for 4.5 years, it feels like now.
In this episode, we ask, what has gone wrong at Charlton Athletic?
There's certainly been intense unrest and discontent, I think, among fans for several years now, which really has its roots in Roland de Chatelet's takeover in 2014.
Will McGee is a freelance journalist who has worked for Vice, The Mirror and the I newspaper, and who has bylines at The Independent when Saturday comes, Huck, Tribune and The Guardian.
After essentially a deeply unpopular spell as owner, de Chatelet sold the club in January to a consortium called East Street Investments. They've subsequently failed to produce proof of funds to the EFL. They've sort of collapsed into infighting essentially, and they're sort of the owners of the club in name only really. EFL regulations really require clubs to show that they have the funds to get through the season, and Charlton, as I understand it at the moment, can't do that. That being the case, they either need to get new owners or they're at risk of being kicked out of the Football League essentially.
So last week you went along to the most recent fan protests at the Valley. Could you give us sort of sense of the general mood from that day?
There's a lot of anger, obviously. Anger at East Street Investments and the people involved behind that. Anger at Roland de Chatelet. Quite a lot of anger at the EFL for allowing this to happen, really. You know, obviously there's been an ongoing debate for years about the strength of the regulation in terms of ownership in football and in the EFL specifically. And, you know, last year issues at Bury and Bolton. This year, you know, Wigan are in trouble as well. So I think there's a lot of frustration that Charlton are in the same boat and that nothing has been done to make that ongoing issue any better. There was also some hope as well because there is a prospective owner, a new owner kind of in the wings, a guy called Thomas Sandgaard. While obviously everyone is very circumspect and cautious about people who want to own Charlton Athletic, given what's happened in the last few years, he does seem like a serious prospective owner. So I think there's cautious hope as well as everything else.
There does seem to be a little bit more positivity around the fan base than there was at Bury, for example.
I think Charlton fans see that there is a route out of this. It's not like the sort of despair, I think, that really descended on Bury, in that, you know, Charlton fans can see that hopefully they will survive. So I think that there's determination to force that survival, you know, make sure that they pressure the EFL, pressure their current owners and get the word out there of what's happening at the club and not go quietly.
So the recent off-field history of Charlton Athletic is protracted and complex. Whichever way you look at it, you end up at a man you've already mentioned, Roland de Chatelet. Can you tell us a little bit about him and his ownership at the club?
De Chatelet is from Belgium. He's a sort of businessman, a millionaire, and a sort of marginal political figure as well, who founded a sort of liberal centrist political party called Vivant. So he's quite an interesting character. Over the last decade, he's sort of started investing in football, which has not gone that well for him necessarily. He's owned various clubs. So Charlton were part of a network of clubs really at one point. Currently, I think he's still the sort of main shareholder in Carl Zeiss Jena in Germany and Újpest in Hungary as well. Previously, he owned Standard Liège, but he was sort of essentially driven out by protests there a few years ago. And he's also owned sort of shares in various other clubs. His ownership at Charlton, as I mentioned, he bought the club in January 2014 and straight away made himself fairly unpopular. It didn't take long for him to make the decision to sack Chris Powell as manager.
We're outside the Valley ahead of Charlton's game against Huddersfield tonight.
And we want to ask the Charlton fans what they think about Chris Powell being sacked this week.
Outrageous. Absolutely outrageous.
I think it's absolutely disgusting.
I think it's a bad decision, and I think that most people here tonight will feel the same way.
Chris Powell's a legend at Charlton, played there, managed them, had not too long previously got them promoted from League One back to the Championship. So that was a very unpopular decision, but that was sort of just the start of what transpired after that, really, and that was kind of more a spark than the core kind of reasons for the anger at his ownership. Charlton changed managers, I think, 6 times in 2 years, in the first 2 years that he was in charge. There were some wildly inappropriate kind of appointments made, like there was a guy called Karel Fry who was appointed as manager who I think previously had been managing in the Belgian 3rd Division. There were allegations that when Chris Powell had still been in charge that de Chatelet had sort of suggested players for him to start and team selections and stuff, which I think people saw as a huge overreach by an owner. One of the ideas behind him owning this network of football clubs was that he would be able to internally regulate certain aspects of football's bonkers economy. His transfer policy included trading players between the clubs, which generally for Charlton, who were trying to survive in the Championship, was a disaster. And likewise, players who were very popular at Charlton and who had done quite well for them were sort of moved on.
There's lots of football fans who are disgruntled at their owners. What do you think it was in particular that really turned the fans against de Chatelet?
There was sort of a variety of things that got his tenure off on the wrong foot. But then increasingly there were just PR disasters on his part. I think at one point there was a statement put up on the Charlton website that basically accused fans of wanting the club to fail and things that just really, really got under people's skin. And that's continued pretty much throughout his time as owner. Communications either in the media or using the Charlton website, which have just been kind of wildly, wildly unpopular with fans. Most importantly, really, was that increasingly it became clear that behind the scenes at the club, things were being managed in a very unorthodox way and a very dysfunctional way. And that was kind of leaked by previous club employees, by Charlton fans who kind of turned investigative journalist. There were kind of a variety of cases of Charlton fans kind of doing their own grassroots journalism to get to the heart of what was going on behind the scenes. It was felt not only was he making bad decisions on a football basis, but also that he was kind of actively damaging the club from within. I think people saw him as a very kind of cold and arrogant figure who wasn't open to changing his ways or indeed listening to any external advice. And as such, he just became a deeply, deeply unpopular figure, I think, that people really rallied against.
At what point did the protests really start kicking off?
Obviously, there have been ongoing protests on off pretty much since he took over, but especially I think they started to really gain traction in kind of 2015, 2016. Charlton fans used all sorts of methods to get their point across, partially inspired, I think, by Standard Liège fans who, as I mentioned, had kind of ousted him. There were all sorts of protests. There were small, toy plastic pigs were thrown on the pitch at one point.
The first statement at this one at the Valley saw pigs actually fly. 3,000 plastic pigs rained onto the pitch in a bizarre protest by both sets of fans.
There were beach balls. I remember there were people would take North Korean flags to games, I think, as a statement on the kind of propagandizing of his kind of ownership regime. A degree of it was kind of direct action, as I say, disrupting games. There was a pitch invasion at one point, banners in the stands and things like that. Likewise, a lot of it as well was just, a more traditional form of football protest, I guess, fans just making it clear that they were really very unhappy with his ownership.
OK, you've been around for a few weeks, but we can officially say now, Matt Southall, welcome to Charlton Athletic. Let's start at the very beginning. January the 2nd, it was confirmed that East Street Investments had purchased the club. Why Charlton? What is it about Charlton Athletic that made it such an appealing prospect for ESI?
Oh, it's a big club. The heritage of the club, the fan base.
In the end, though, this pressure from the fans led to de Chatelet selling the club. In January 2020, Charlton Athletic were acquired by East Street Investments, an Abu Dhabi company, in a deal that was subject to approval from the EFL. What was the general fan feeling about this deal?
Initially, there was quite a lot of optimism, or at least relief about the deal. I think that was just purely on the basis of people being delighted to see the back of de Chatelet. But as it turns out, things might be more complex on that front.
And it didn't take long for this deal to unravel. So what went wrong?
As it's subsequently transpired, ESI, or East Street Investments, as you say, failed to show proof of funds to the EFL. Earlier this year, there was a very public fallout between their majority shareholder, Tanun Nimer, and the club's chairman, Matt Southall. Claim and counterclaim were made, but I think Nimer accused Southall of essentially misusing club funds, and Southall accused Nimer of essentially not having the money to be able to bankroll the club or support the club. Subsequently, I think Nimer said that he wouldn't be putting any more money into the club, although whether he put any money into the club in the first place is obviously up for debate. They bought the club for £1, which is often not a good sign, I think, in football. Since then, it's been pretty much chaos. Southall's kind of been ousted as chairman, I think, although he's still on the scene. And yeah, I think actually Charlton fans are confused as to who really owns the club, or whether anyone really owns the club in more than just an entirely sort of token sense.
And if this wasn't confusing enough already, ESI themselves are also under a takeover bid from a consortium led by a businessman called Paul Elliott. And recently this hit the rocks too. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Paul Elliott came from left field as a potential sort of internal takeover candidate for ESI. That has only thrown things into greater confusion as to who owns the club, I think, because he felt that he had an agreement to buy the club from Nimer, then he failed the owners and directors test that the EFL sets alongside Chris Farnell, I believe, who was a lawyer representing him. That means that he is, I suppose, a failed takeover candidate at this stage. Although he, I think, is continuing legal action to try and get that reversed, and has also appealed against his disbarring by the EFL. Charlton fans were quite worried about his potential involvement. I think people are very, very unsure of what his intentions are. And likewise, Farnell represented Bury last year during their collapse. And I think his involvement with that situation means that there's intense suspicion and mistrust among Charlton fans for what role he's playing, essentially.
And if the fans thought that they were free from de Chatelet, it remains the case that de Chatelet still owns the Valley, Charlton's football ground, and the training ground as well. What's the situation here?
In principle, de Chatelet had an agreement with ESI that they would buy the training ground and the Valley from him for £50 million, which some people have suggested is quite an inflated figure in terms of their value or their worth. Certainly not their metaphorical worth, but their real estate worth, I suppose. Obviously, with ESI not being able to produce proof of funds, that £50 million figure is pie in the sky, really. So essentially, yeah, de Chatelet still owns the ground and the training ground. That just makes the situation even more kind of intractable, in that there's now a kind of separation of various parts of the club among various private interests. But as I understand it, Thomas Sandgaard, the new prospective owner, feels that he can do a deal with all of these multiple parties that will work. It remains to be seen whether that can be done, but certainly it complicates any successful present or future takeover, because whoever's looking to take over the club is going to have to negotiate with a whole host of competing, vying factions and groups.
Much of Charlton's recent woes have come down, as you've said, to an inability to prove that the club have sufficient funds. And you've mentioned already the demise of clubs like Bury and Bolton. Bury in particular had an owner who ended up running the club into the ground last year and couldn't provide proof of funds, and that has led to Bury FC dropping out of the football leagues. Would you say there's similarities between these two situations?
Yeah, there are. Charlton fans have certainly drawn attention to the fact that they could be facing a Bury situation and that they could, in theory, go the same way. Obviously, if they're not able to produce proof of funds ahead of the start of the new season, they face a whole host of potential sanctions from the EFL, the most serious of which is, eventually being kicked out of the competition. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen. Firstly, as I mentioned, people are hopeful that there will be a successful takeover by someone who actually does have the requisite funds between now and the start of the season. Although certainly there's uncertainty there and, that's not something that's been resolved. Lots of people have suggested that in terms of PR and the kind of political side of it, it would be an utter shambolic disaster for the EFL to have Charlton kicked out of league competition, given that after the Bury sort of fiasco, everyone said this can never happen again. And here we are literally a year later, and it could happen to a club that last season was in the Championship. That would really be an absolute indictment of the EFL's inability to bring in stronger regulation on, ethical and responsible ownership, and their inability really to police their own competition. So I think that there is probably not much appetite at the EFL for the situation to become that drastic. I think there's hopefully a kind of political will to make sure that Charlton don't end up with such a drastic demise. But it's certainly a possibility, and it's certainly something that Charlton fans are ultimately afraid of.
Are you a fan of Football Today? Why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full and unedited interviews, and lots more extra content. To join us, just visit patreon.com and search for Football Today. Now back to today's episode. In many respects, we are living in a time when it feels as though football has never been less about the fans. Hearing about the plight of Charlton Athletic drives this point home.
My granddad was born, pretty much at the ground, if you listen to his stories, but was born very close to the ground and went ever since he was a kid and used to take us as we were growing up.
Sam Cooke is a Charlton fan and a board member of the Charlton Athletic Supporters Trust.
So yeah, I've been a fan my whole life, despite not living there.
At what point did you realise that things were going bad for the club?
Initially, during the Roland de Chatelet era of ownership, I suppose we were wary, but we were cautiously optimistic, I suppose. I mean, he did certain things right, like paid for the new pitch and so on and so forth, but then there were a string of different managers, a string of players from his network of clubs who certainly weren't fit to play Championship or even League One level football, and it kind of descended from there really, like things went from bad to worse. And whilst we did bounce back from League One into the Championship, of course more recently, after de Chatelet sold at least part of the club, things have got worse still.
How long did it take for the Charlton Athletic Supporters Trust to get involved?
They've been involved the whole time. Like, they were involved in a lot of the de Chatelet, the movement against de Chatelet as well, but still trying to maintain communications with him, of course, as is understandable. But ultimately, they just want what is best for the club. I've only actually been involved with the Supporters Trust myself as a board member for about 3 months now. So since things got particularly bad is when I've been involved. But yeah, they've been involved for a while.
And what sort of involvement have the Supporters Trust had in holding the club's owners to account?
Plenty. I mean, in terms of trying to unite the wider fan base, they've been running the Our Club campaign, which has now had over 5,000 signatures, which is an indicator of if we need to make the move for a crowdfunding campaign to keep the club alive. That's what that campaign is for, basically. They've also been speaking to media and trying to get word out there about the severity of the situation throughout the whole process, as well as maintaining or attempting to maintain some kind of form of official comms with the club and people still involved with the club. Though, of course, that has been pretty complicated.
And how much has changed for you as the club has moved from de Chatelet to ESI? Do you feel like you're sort of fighting the same battles but with different people?
As it was at the beginning of the de Chatelet era, there was certainly like cautious optimism, at least from most of the fan base, with Nima and with Matt Southall at the helm as well. Southall went to a lot of the games and took the photos with the kids and looked the part, right? And we were all very excited and optimistic about the future. Then it's kind of gone very much downhill since then.
Obviously, there's been a number of horror stories regarding bad ownership at football clubs, some of which have ended up with the clubs going into liquidation. How worried do these stories make you, given that there seems to be a bit of overlap with what's happening at Charlton now?
I mean, huge overlap. Chris Farnell was involved in Bury at various points before that went as bad as it could, right? Before they went into administration, which is terribly sad. And just another case of another EFL club going down the pan through concerning ownership, basically. I think the EFL needs to do a lot more in terms of vetting the potential owners of the clubs. It's a very, very real situation that Charlton could go the same way, in essence. And that's obviously what we're all fighting to avoid. And the size of the club, the size of the valley, the history of the club, and so on and so forth. I think many think that, that couldn't happen to us, but I think all football clubs think that.
Smoke litany, not regime! Smoke litany, not regime!
And what's the Supporters Trust been doing recently in standing up to the club's owners? There's been a few protests that have been publicised in the media. What's the Supporters Trust been doing on that front?
Yeah, there was a protest at which over 500, maybe 600 people attended at the ground a week or two ago now. And of that wasn't actually organised by the Trust itself, but with other various fan groups, of which, of course, the Supporters Trust is one. So there was that, and in general still just trying to maintain as many comms with media that we've spoken to Talk Sport, to BBC. Heather was on one of the podcasts with The Athletic and so on. So just essentially trying to promote to the media the severity of the current state of play with Charlton as possible. Yeah, which has been difficult, but which is still the main thing, to get as many football fans aware of how bad things are at Charlton right now, and in essence how it could happen to any football club.
How does going through something like this change your opinion of football fandom? Do you feel differently about football than you did before all of this, obviously starting with de Chatelet, but now the ESI stuff has been going on?
I guess what has been nice with the whole Our Club campaign and all of the promotions around online, obviously there's been the Save CAFC hashtag floating around a lot on Twitter and such. What has been nice is the amount of other football fans of Fulham, of Wigan, of numerous other clubs, of Bury as well, like the Supporters Trust and different fan groups from those clubs who kind of united in a bid to save Charlton and put the onus on our club. And I think that hasn't changed my opinion of it as such. That's what kind of assumed and hoped would happen. But yeah, there were fans of different clubs that came down to the protest, for example. So yeah, it definitely shows that it's kind of all together approach, which is really nice to see.
So is there a light at the end of the tunnel for Charlton, in your opinion?
Well, we hope so. And the light may well be a quite wealthy Danish man. The Thomas Sandgaard attempt at acquisition of the club is ongoing, and we've spoken to him on the Trust a few times. It's just a difficult situation with acquiring Charlton right now, because you have East Street Investments and you have de Chatelet, who still owns the ground, the training facilities and the physical assets as such. So is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Yeah, I mean, we hope so, right? But it's still at a stage where it's pretty precarious, and we can't basically take our finger off the pulse right now. Now is the time that all fans do need to unite if we are to save the club.
Will McGee is a freelance journalist. You can read his writing at Vice, The Mirror, The Eye newspaper, The Independent, When Saturday Comes, Huck, Tribune and The Guardian. Sam Cooke is a Charlton fan and a board member of the Charlton Athletic Supporters Trust. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons licence by Blue Dot Sessions, and each song is listed in the show notes. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today.